The lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Ann Wagner, the gentlelady from Missouri, for 5 minutes.
I thank my friend Chairman Green for the time, and again thank our witnesses for being here today. As I mentioned in my opening, that right now the cost of goods is rising at a faster pace than the rate of wage growth, and people are being forced to put a larger portion of their paychecks towards necessities to make ends meet. Studies show that inflation is disproportionately more difficult to bear for lower income and minority households. And just last week, during our full committee hearing on the ties between housing and inflation, we saw that many households throughout the country are limited by rent or home buying power or lack thereof. Dr. Darity, do you believe that the current inflation rate is exacerbating the racial wealth gap?
I certainly think that the current inflation rate, as you suggested, has a disproportionate impact on low-income families and particularly Black and Latino families as well. But I don't think there's a significant relationship to the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is primarily driven by the intergenerational transfers of resources that are disproportionately held by white Americans in comparison with, say, Black Americans. Dr. Francis talked about that in some detail in her remarks. I think that the inflation has an adverse effect on people's capacity to save, but personal savings is not the primary factor that drives people's wealth accumulation. It's what you get from your parents and your grandparents that is really decisive in terms of determining your wealth position, and that has been racially disparate in the United States for multiple generations.
Well, let me go on and kind of cite the Bureau of Labor Statistics here. And according to them, the median weekly earnings in the third quarter of 2022 for Black, Hispanic, Latino workers with full-time jobs were about $300 lower than those of white and Asian workers. Dr. Darity, if wages rise slower than the rate of inflation, what is the net effect? And is it therefore fair to say that rising prices are disproportionately more painful for Black, Hispanic, Latino workers?
No, I acknowledge that, but in terms of the implications for the racial wealth gap, they're marginal. They are not significant or important. The racial wealth gap is not primarily a consequence of differences in savings outcomes across families. It is a consequence of the inability of Black families to transfer substantial resources to subsequent generations because of the nation's history of deprivation of previous generations from the opportunity to accumulate wealth.
Thank you, Dr. Darity. Dr. Fetterman, you talked a little bit about the research that you have done. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what the difficulties are in finding kind of a one-size-fits-all solution with such a large group of impacted people? What steps do we need to take to understand all of the perspectives?
Thank you for that question. And I think one is to prepare ourselves that there's not going to be consensus, and that doesn't mean that there's something wrong. As we move forward in working with affected communities, for example, and Dr. Rockman talked about Brown Brothers Harriman, but that's from the Alexander Brown and Son family, which is based originally out of Baltimore. There's so much to do in Baltimore that the banks could work together in that area, those institutions that are legacy institutions, to just address what's happening in Baltimore. So there's a lot of local level activities that can be done. People in these communities know what they need. We can walk into these communities and know what they need. So it's not terribly mysterious, but I think we're going to want to look at a plan that includes the housing. And in the wake of George Floyd, when we saw a lot of American financial institutions give money for racial equity, they often did it in the form of loans that they could profit from. And I think it's very important as we engage these corporations going forward that we're talking about grants, housing grants, student loan grants as well, not just more loans because people are so buried into debt. So I think we want to engage continuously with affected communities, have these conversations with them about what they need, support those organizations that have proved to be effective that are simply underfunded. And then there may be a conversation about like whether people should be getting checks. I mean, that's going to be a conversation for the nation to have as well.
Thank you very much. I have used all my time, and I yield back to the chair.